So, living with the light, today we're going to be talking about Kiddush. Not Kiddush like when you show up to shul and in the morning and everybody gathers downstairs for Kiddush, but the act of making Kiddush, of sanctifying the Shabbos, which primarily happens Friday night, as we'll explain momentarily. Um, Although we do call the Shabbos day Kiddush as well, but the main Kiddush is Friday night. So in this week's parsha, we have the Ten Commandments, and one of them is Zachor es Yom HaShabbos lekadisho. Remember the day of Shabbos to sanctify it. And we have a command here to remember the Shabbos and to sanctify it. So what does that mean? So there's various understandings, but the most practical and the most applicable would be as a straight up mitzvah, Torah mitzvah, is to sanctify the Shabbos at the beginning of Shabbos and maybe even at the end of Shabbos. That was a Havdalah discussion. But certainly at the beginning of Shabbos, we have a mitzvah right here to sanctify the Shabbos. How do we sanctify the Shabbos? So we declare the sanctity of Shabbos. We declare how Shabbos is special and holy, and that is how we fulfill the mitzvah of Zachor es Yom HaShabbos, to remember the day of Shabbos, to sanctify it. And that's what we call Kiddush, making Kiddush, from the word lekadesh, to sanctify. And the formula that we have for Kiddush, seemingly composed by the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the men of the Great Assembly. So that's a formula for fulfilling it, but really the basic requirement of the Torah's basic requirement would be filled with much less than that, by just declaring the sanctity of Shabbos. We'll discuss shortly, it's possible that there's more than just declaring the sanctity of Shabbos. Maybe we have to mention the Exodus, but we'll leave that discussion for later. But the basic mitzvah is to declare the sanctity of Shabbos. Technically speaking, according to many authorities, when they pray the evening service, they daven Ma'ariv, and they declare the sanctity of Shabbos at Ma'ariv, they've actually fulfilled their Torah obligation of Kiddush, because the Torah obligation is just to declare the sanctity of Shabbos. And by the time you get home, or if you daven at home, you've already fulfilled the requirement of sanctifying the Shabbos, the Torah obligation. It could be, according to some, even just saying Good Shabbos is a fulfillment of the Torah obligation. Shabbat Shalom, declaring something special about Shabbos. If what you mean by Good Shabbos is special, you don't just mean the same as Good Wednesday. It's different. Good Shabbos is declaring that's a special day. So it could be you fulfilled the Torah obligation already by saying Good Shabbos. Okay, that's debated, but certainly to declare the sanctity of Shabbos would seemingly be a fulfillment of the Torah obligation. Now, this obligation is when Shabbos comes in. It's at the beginning of Shabbos, as Shabbos begins. If one doesn't fulfill it at the beginning of Shabbos, then it carries over. It's at some point to do it. Even if one would go to sleep and has not yet made Kiddush, when they wake up in the morning, they would still make Kiddush. Now, what is the difference between the Friday night Kiddush and the Shabbos day Kiddush? Well, if you think about it, actually, besides for the verses that we read, the Shabbos day Kiddush is just the blessing over wine. It's just Borei Pri Hagafen. There's no blessing of Mikadesh HaShabbos, to sanctify Shabbos. On Friday night, we have two blessings. We have the blessing, we have verses. We read verses by Yechul Hashemayim V'Aretz V'Chol Tzva'am, right? By Yer Vayvoker Yom HaShisha. We read from the end of the creation of the world, but that's like just extra stuff that we say. And of course of significance, but it's not part of the central mitzvah. Then we have the blessing over the wine, Borei Pri Hagafen, and then we have another blessing, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech hamashiach kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'ratzavanu. We have then a blessing of Kiddush, which closes Baruch Atah Hashem Mikadesh HaShabbos, who sanctifies the Shabbos. That's the blessing of Kiddush. That we don't do on Shabbos day. So on Shabbos day, we have Kiddush, but in the language of the sages of the Gemara, it's Kiddush Rabbah. It's the great Kiddush. Well, how is it so great if you don't even say the words Kiddush? And the understanding is that, according to some at least, that they were trying to make it seem great, meaning they wanted the Shabbos day meal, which is equal in importance basically to the Friday night meal, and more or less. And so they wanted to give significance to the Shabbos day meal as well. So they said, we're also going to have Kiddush on Shabbos day. But that's a rabbinic enactment to give significance to the Shabbos day meal. But it's just to make a blessing over wine to start it off, to kick it off. But there's no blessing of Mekadesh HaShabbos at the Shabbos day meal. It's only Friday night, unless for some reason somebody didn't make Kiddush Friday night, then they would still say the blessing Mekadesh HaShabbos on Shabbos day. So the Torah requirement is just to declare the sanctity of Shabbos. Where does the wine come in? So the Gemara tells us, and I put it on the source sheet, the second source, Psachim 106a, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Zachoras Yom HaShabbos L'Kadesho, remember the Shabbos to sanctify it, Zochreu al hayayin, remember it over wine. Now there's seemingly no allusion in the words remember the Shabbos, anything about wine there. Who said anything about wine? It usually, like, if the Gemara quotes a verse, it derives from that verse somehow what it's about to say. Where does it say in that verse that it should be over wine? So Tosfos in his commentary notes that there are a number of places throughout Tanakh where we do have wine in the context of remembering. So he quotes a verse in Hosea. It says, Zachro ki yayin Levanon. It's the memory of something is like the wine of Lebanon. And in Shir Hashirim, Nazkira dodayach miyayin. So I remember dodayach might be flowers or something from like wine. So or your dearness, I'm not sure what the context is, but the point is that we have a couple of places where remembering is associated with wine, and so the word remembering could be associated with wine. That being said, according to almost all of the Rishonim, the early commentaries, this is a rabbinic enactment to do it over wine, and it's just an allusion in the verse. They're not saying this is what the verse is actually saying. They're finding an allusion for the concept of making Kiddush over wine. There are some who hold that it's part of the Torah requirement, but they're a minority. And the accepted opinion is that the Torah requirement is just declaring the sanctity of Shabbos, and the having it done over wine is a rabbinic enactment, which then leads us to the question, why? Why did the rabbis enact that we should make Kiddush over wine? So the Sefer HaChinuch writes, and the Sefer HaChinuch makes it his business to try to explain the reasoning behind each of the mitzvahs. He goes through all the mitzvahs and he tries to explain some of the basic construct, the rules, and then a bit of a reason. And here he's really elaborating on the rabbinic edition of doing it over wine. And he says, because the nature of a person is that it's awakened more when they are satisfied and happy. And he says, I already wrote earlier in the work that a person's awakened by what they do. It has an impact on the way that they think, basically. So what we do impacts how we think. And so putting ourselves in a good mood, having a little bit of wine to put ourselves in a good mood, so that's going to help elevate the experience of sanctifying Shabbos, and will connect to the idea of sanctifying Shabbos on a new level, because it's something that it's within the context of an enjoyable activity. Now, I think with that alone, we should be drinking wine with everything that we do then. So, I mean, maybe some do that, but the rabbis only enacted wine over here, and really in some other contexts as well, like we have at a bris, the person who makes the blessing for the child for after it makes a hagafen, they make a blessing on wine. There are certain contexts where we do bring forth wine, maybe to add a little extra joy to the occasion. But it seems that it's fair to say that there's something unique about Shabbos that we want to elevate the experience of sanctifying the Shabbos by bringing in some pleasures like wine. And that's really derived from the verse in Yeshaya and Isaiah. I did not put it on the source sheet, but we've definitely spoken about it before. The verse that says, Vikarasa la Shabbos oneg. You should declare Shabbos as a delight. And that's where we derive the concept of oneg Shabbos, of delighting in Shabbos, that there's a mitzvah to experience pleasure on Shabbos, to have oneg Shabbos, and and again, I think we've spoken about this in various contexts, but on the most simple level, I think we could say that Shabbos is supposed to be a taste of the world to come, and and so we want to experience a bit of extra pleasure to kind of enhance that taste, that sense, that really it sets our goals correctly, it resets our goals, it redirects us and says every 7 days experience a Shabbos to remind yourself that this world is but a corridor, it's but a place of preparation for the next world, and each Shabbos when we experience that oneg, then we're reminded of that. And and so as we sanctify the Shabbos, it's coupled with oneg, it's coupled with that enjoyment, which is central to Shabbos, because much of Shabbos, again, so many different ideas about Shabbos, obviously, but one major theme of Shabbos is this idea that it's a taste of the world to come, and that oneg that pleasure gives us a little bit of a taste of it. And and therefore it's not just the wine that we associate with Kiddush, but actually the halacha is that Kiddush has to be said in the place where you have your meal. Kiddush b'makom su'uda. So I put that on the source sheet. It's the fourth box. Also in Psachim, in the last chapter of Psachim. The last chapter of Psachim deals with the laws of the Pesach Seder, and it segues into laws of Kiddush as well. So over there it says, those people who recite Kiddush in shul, Rav said they have not fulfilled their obligation of a blessing over wine, meaning when they get home, if they want to have more wine, they'll have to make another blessing. But they have fulfilled the obligation of reciting Kiddush. Rav says you could fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush in shul, even though you're not having a meal there. But Shmuel said even the obligation of Kiddush they have not fulfilled, and they have to recite Kiddush again at home. And I left it off the English, but Shmuel says the reason why they make Kiddush in shul is for people who are guests in the shul and sleeping in the shul. And so in some shuls that custom has carried over to this day, even though generally speaking people don't sleep over in the shul and have their meals there. But that was what people would sometimes do. And and it explains, Shmuel says you don't fulfill your obligation of Kiddush if you're going home. Shmuel follows his line of reasoning. As Shmuel said, there is no valid Kiddush except in the place of one's Shabbos meal. Ein Kiddush ella b'makom suda. You have to have your Kiddush in the place where you eat your meal. And the commentary of the Rashbam on that Gemara, the Rashbam says exactly what we just said before, that it's derived from this idea of the karasa la Shabbos oneg. You should declare Shabbos a delight. And he says that, meaning to say, you declare Shabbos with Kiddush should be where you delight. The karasa la Shabbos, you should declare Shabbos, meaning a reference to Kiddush. Oneg, it should be in the same place as your delight. And really making, so we have this mitzvah of oneg. We're supposed to have pleasure on Shabbos, but making Kiddush before you begin to indulge really puts the right, framework. It frames it properly for us what that oneg is about. If we just jump right into to oneg, to pleasures on Shabbos, without first declaring the sanctity of Shabbos, we might forget what the oneg is really about. But by first declaring the sanctity of Shabbos, we start with Kiddush, and then we have our meal, we have oneg, we have enjoyment. So the Kiddush at the beginning of the meal really frames what the experience of oneg is supposed to be for. It's supposed to be a celebration of the sanctity of Shabbos, the beauty of Shabbos, and like I said before, that sense and that taste of the world to come. Robert.
This passage from Safim, this is talking about the Friday night Kiddush, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Now, coming back to the comment um, of the Sefer HaChinuch, who said that by starting the meal with wine, or by making Kiddush over wine, he said that puts us in a good mood. It brings us joy, and as a result, our experience of Kiddush will be elevated. So, so the Baal Shem Tov, I saw quoted, gives a mashal, gives a parable to understand this concept. He says that there was a handicapped person and a deaf person, and they were sitting together, and and suddenly a band struck up a joyous melody. So the handicapped person, he wanted to get up and dance. He heard the beautiful music and he wanted to get up and dance, but he couldn't do that. He wasn't capable of doing that um, because of his physical impairment. So he looks to his friend, hoping that his friend will pick him up, or hold him up, or put him on his shoulders, or whatever. And the friend who's deaf has no idea that there's any music playing. So so the handicapped person, he's enjoying the music. He wants to dance. He can't, and uh, and the uh, and the deaf person is oblivious to the fact that there's any music, and even if he signs to him to start dancing, he's not in the mood for it. He doesn't. There's nothing that would get him up to dance right now. So the person who's physically impaired, he says he has an idea. He gives his friend a few drinks, and that kind of gets the deaf man up and about, and now he's in a good mood, and he gets up and he puts him on his shoulders, and they dance together. That's the mashal. That's the parable that the Baal Shem Tov said. And the nimshal, the lesson, is that the 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 person who's physically impaired, that represents the neshama, the soul. The soul is spiritual, and but it doesn't it kind of it needs our body to come along for the ride. The deaf man represents our body, and you come to Shabbos, and the soul is so excited that it's Shabbos. It's ready to get up and dance, to enjoy, to take pleasure in just the beauty of Shabbos itself. But our physical selves are sometimes not quite ready for that. We're not we're a little more sluggish. So so we give our physical selves a little enjoyment, a little wine, a little bit of an enjoyable meal, and now together the body and the soul can get up and be ready to celebrate in unison. And and I saw this quote in a book called The Serenity of Shabbos Kodesh, and then the author there added that there is a little bit of a difference between the mashal, the parable, and what actually occurs. Because in the mashal, although the deaf man gets up to dance, he still doesn't hear the music. He still doesn't experience the music. But in truth, when our body gets up to enjoy Shabbos along with our soul, it experiences that music. It gets that Shabbos enjoyment, the spiritual enjoyment. It doesn't only have the physical enjoyment. It's now attuned to the spiritual enjoyment as well. And if you take it all the way to Tchias HaMesim, to the resurrection, so there's going to be a resurrection where our bodies and souls will be perfectly in tune with each other, and the body will experience the same reward as the soul. And so the body will be able to experience all that spiritual pleasure that the soul experiences. So, but for now, for the time being, it's like the Sefer HaChinuch says that um, that the enactment of the sages to make Kiddush over wine can be understood to be a way to get our physical selves into the proper elevated mood for really enjoying the beauty of the spiritual side of Shabbos. And sometimes it takes a little bit of physical enjoyment to be able to awaken us to a spiritual enjoyment. Um, we touched on a Mishnah last week. We were learning about Tu B'Shvat last week, and we were talking about Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and we mentioned the Mishnah about what should be the order for Kiddush. And I put it back on the source sheet, and the Mishnah says the beginning of um, in page 51b of Maseches Brachos, it says it lists off matters of dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel with regards to meals, and one of them is with regards to Kiddush. Beis Shammai omrim mevarech al hayom v'achar mevarech al hayayin. Beis Shammai says, as we mentioned before, there's two brachos at the Friday night Kiddush. One is on the wine, and one is on Shabbos, on sanctifying the Shabbos. Beis Shammai says you first sanctify the Shabbos, and then you make the blessing on the wine. Beis Hillel says that you first make the blessing on the wine, and then you sanctify the Shabbos. And that's what we do. We rule like Beis Hillel, so we first have the bracha of Borei Pri Hagafen on the wine, and then we have the bracha on Shabbos, Mikadesh HaShabbos. So, what are they arguing about? So the Gemara has a couple of explanations, and last week we mentioned the Talmud Yerushalmi has another explanation. But I recall once reading, once hearing that it may relate to what we're discussing right now. That Beis Shammai is always kind of like the stricter or holds people on a more lofty level. So Beis Shammai says you start with sanctifying Shabbos, and you're so excited that it's Shabbos, you want to celebrate, so then you have the wine. Beis Hillel says that's not how not how everybody works. Beis Hillel says you start with the wine. That gets you into the proper mood, and then you sanctify the Shabbos. Now, you're not drinking the wine before you sanctify the Shabbos. You're just making the blessing on the wine, then making the blessing on Shabbos, on Kiddush, and then you're drinking. But conceptually, he's saying that we need to start with the wine. That puts us in the right mood. We're in a joyous mood now, and now we can start to enjoy Shabbos. Once we're in the right mood from a physical standpoint, then we could be in the right mood from a spiritual standpoint to properly enjoy the spiritual side of Shabbos. So that's perhaps a reason why we first make the bracha on the wine and then on the Shabbos, because we need the wine to get us into the mood for Shabbos, to get us into that that joyous frame of mind to be able to enjoy Shabbos. Okay, so that is with regards to making Kiddush over wine. Now I want to turn to what I alluded to before, which is mentioning Yetzias Mitzrayim, mentioning the Exodus. So let's just actually take a step back first and consider the difference between the Ten Commandments as listed in Parshas Yisro, in the book of Shemos, versus the Ten Commandments listed in Parshas Va'eschanan in the book of Devarim. So in this week's Parshas Yisro, the first verse on the page, we started reading it, Zachor es Yom HaShabbos l'kadsho, remember the Shabbos to sanctify it, Sheshes Yamim Tavod v'asisa kol melachtecha, for 6 days you should work and do all your work, And the seventh day is the Shabbos to Hashem. Don't do any work. Okay? And then verse 10, Pasuk Yud, Ki sheishes yomim asa Hashem es hashamayim v'es haaretz. Because God created the world in 6 days, the heavens and the earth, es hayom es kasher bam, the sea and everything in them. Vayanach bayom hashvi, and he rested on the seventh day. Akim berach Hashem es yom haShabbos vayikadshim, and therefore God blessed Shabbos and he sanctified it. So in the Ten Commandments in the book of Shemos, it says that we keep the Shabbos because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day, and blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. If you're looking at the source sheet, you have the second side. If we look at the verses in the book of Devarim, in the Ten Commandments there, so first of all, it says Shamor es Yom HaShabbos l'kachrim. Instead of saying Zachor, remember the Shabbos, it says Shamor, guard the Shabbos. Kasher tzivcha Hashem elkecha, like Hashem commanded you. That's also an addition, as the Lord your God commanded you. And then it says Sheishes Yom Tavod v'asisa kol melachtecha. For 6 days you should work and do all your work and do all your labor. And then it says, and on the seventh day it should be Shabbos. Don't do any work, you and your household and your animals, etc. And then it says in verse 14, nothing about creating the world. It says, V'zacharta ki eved hayisa be'eretz Mitzrayim. And you should remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Vayotziacha Hashem elkecha misham, and that Hashem took you out from there. Biyad chazaka v'zera netuyah, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, God has commanded you to keep the Shabbos. So it's completely different. In the book of Shemos, it says that Hashem commands us to keep Shabbos because in 6 days he created the world and on the seventh day he rested. And in Devarim, it says it's because we were slaves in Egypt and he took us out with a strong hand, outstretched arm, and therefore he commands us to keep the Shabbos. So I guess the first question is just forget about what it says in Shavuos, just looking at Devarim. What does the Exodus from Egypt have to do with Shabbos? I think that's the most basic first question to be considered. And then we can ask why the difference? Why in one place does it talk about, which one is it, and why does in one place does it talk about the creation of the world, and one place it talks about the Exodus? And maybe just to add to the question, so if you go back to the first side, so the Gemara, the bottom source on 117b of Pesachim, Kuf Yadzayin Beis, Amar Vacha Bar Yaakov, V'tzarech sheyazki Yetzias Mitzrayim v'Kiddush Hayom. One has to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus, in their Kiddush. Ksiv Hacha, it says here, by remembering the Exodus, it says Laman Tizkor Es Yom Tzeischem Eretz Mitzrayim. You have to remember the day that you came out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt. And by Shabbat it says Zachor Es Yom HaShabbos, remember the Shabbos. So it says remember, and so we have like a verbal comparison that it says remember. So just like in one place it says to remember the Exodus, in another place it says remember Shabbos, so remember the Exodus. It's hard to understand exactly how that comparison works, but that's what it says. So now I think it's clear that this teaching is influenced by the fact that the Torah does say in the context of Shabbos that it's to remember the Exodus, right? So although the verbal analogy that it makes does not reference the mentioning the Ten Commandments, because over there it doesn't even say Zachor es Yom HaShabbos. There it says Shamor es Yom HaShabbos. It doesn't say in the context of the Ten Commandments and the Exodus to remember the Shabbos and make Kiddush. So we can't say that that's a source for mentioning the Exodus during Kiddush, but what the Gemara does do is it takes Zachor, remember the Shabbos, which is Kiddush, and it says in another place, remember the Exodus, so that we can put together and say we should remember the Exodus when we make Kiddush. But still our question remains, why are we remembering the Exodus when we make Kiddush? Um, okay. Chaim Merriman, did you still want to say something?
Just a small note. You will think that because in Parsha Yithro we just left Egypt, we should be saying Shamor here instead of Zachor because it's so close to, I mean, the timeline. We just left, remember the Exodus. So it will make more sense because we're in Yithro. So we should be saying Shamor just instead of.
You're saying it's too early to try to remember the Exodus because it just
Uh,
happened. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying not too early. It's apropos. It's timely. In Yithro, we just left. So
Right.
why don't we say Shamor here? And we are saying Zachor. Just
Okay. So, okay. So, number one, what does the Exodus have to do with um, Shabbos? How does Shabbos remember the Exodus? So, so Tosfos um, quotes from a medrash that in fact in Egypt we were slaves and we were enslaved in all the different 39 melachos, the 39 prohibited acts that are forbidden on Shabbos. We were doing all of those in Egypt as slaves. Now those acts really are derived from the building of the Mishkan. Those are the constructive acts that were used in building the Mishkan. But Tosfos says that the Medrash says that those also were all things that we had to do as slaves in Egypt. He has a kind of a gematria to bring that out. It says that they made us work bifarech, which usually is translated as like back-breaking labor, farech, pei reish chaf. But but the word pei reish chaf, there's a certain type of gematria called atbash, which means that you reverse everything. So if so, an aleph becomes a taf, and Bays becomes a shin, etc. So the first letter becomes the last letter, and the second letter becomes the second to last letter. So he says that the word parech in Atbash would be Vav Gimel Lamed, and Vav Gimel Lamed, Vav is 6, Gimel is 3, which makes 9, and Lamed is 30, which is 39. So there's a hint in the words that they made us work bifarech. They made us do back-breaking labor, that the parech was Vav Gimel Lamed was 39, which is an allusion to the 39 melachos of Shabbos. And so when we were freed from Egypt, we were freed from those 39 melachos, those 39 constructive acts that we had to do as slaves. And so on Shabbos, we rest from those as a remembrance that we were freed from having to perform those in Egypt. That is what Tosfos says. And the Maharal kind of says the same idea, but uses it also to explain the difference between Zachor and Shamor. Zachor we usually associate with the positive acts of Shabbos. So like making Kiddush and having a Shabbos meal and or even the rabbinic ones like lighting candles, it's rabbinic, but the positive parts of Shabbos, while Shamor, which means to guard, we associate with the prohibitions and the refraining from work, refraining from malacha on Shabbos. And he says, therefore, what are the positive acts? The positive acts are what give Shabbos its sanctity. We sanctify the Shabbos with Kiddush, with the positive act of making Kiddush, of sanctifying the Shabbos. And we declare that Shabbos is a special day. Well, what makes Shabbos a special day? Why is Shabbos a holy day? Well, Shabbos is a holy day because it's the day that Hashem rested from creating the world. That's why it is holy. And so the positive acts of Zachor are connected with the creation of the world. And so that's why in Yisro, where it says Zachor, it mentions it's to remember the creation because that's what the positive acts of Shabbos are to remember that Hashem created the world, that Shabbos is a holy day because Hashem created the world and gave special sanctity for Shabbos when he rested on that day. On the other hand, in Devarim, it says shamor, guard, and it speaks of refraining from melacha, from constructive work on Shabbos. And it says that that is to remember the Exodus. Because like we're saying, that we by not working, we remember that Hashem rescued us from that backbreaking labor that we were subjected to in Egypt. So um, so therefore, in Devarim, where it says Shamor, it talks about the negative commandments, the prohibitions of refraining from labor. It's associated with the Exodus because that recalls that we were saved from, we were redeemed from that backbreaking labor, and so we refrain on Shabbos. That's the Maral. And so just to bring it back to Kiddush, it would we would be saying it's appropriate to mention um, within, even though Kiddush is a positive commandment, we have to say, I guess, that at the same time we also want to remember, as we sanctify Shabbos, we also want to remember the Exodus, because that is also part of something that we're supposed to remember on Shabbos. At least it will set our minds to that our refraining from malacha is in order to remember the Exodus. Okay, but in the remaining few minutes, I want to share with you the Malbim's commentary, and the Malbim in our parsha in Yisro, when he talks about the Aseret Sedibros, he talks about Zachor and Shamor. He develops a whole approach, and really he references back to his commentary in Bereshis by the creation, which really he already discussed much of it there. So the Malbim says that Shabbos actually demonstrates two beliefs. Number one is that it's the day that Hashem rested from creation. Hashem created the world in 6 days and then resting on the seventh. And number two is that on Shabbos, the Shabbos of creation, God entered or began a new way of relating to the world that wasn't there during the first 6 days of creation. And this is what he elaborates on in his commentary in Bereshis. And he says that really there's two kind of ways that the world operates. One is through nature, through a system of nature that God created that just runs on autopilot, and it's set laws of nature, laws of physics, and the world just runs through a natural process. And then there's a second level of operation in the world, which is what we would call hashgacha, where Hashem oversees and intervenes and interacts with the world, and sometimes even contrary to the laws of nature. And even sometimes within the laws of nature, but outside the laws of nature. What I mean by that is that if everything was running naturally, then whether we do mitzvos or not, it would rain or it wouldn't rain or whatever, right? Nothing to do with our actions. But yet, and that's how the world was created in 6 days, that there was a natural system. There was no man that would impact that system. But on the 6th day in the afternoon, God creates man. And when God creates man, and he says you're going to be responsible for the world, he also empowers him that his actions, his or her actions, impact the world and really impact nature. And we don't necessarily see how God realigns things, but like we read in Shema, that if we do mitzvos, it will rain, and if we don't, the heavens will stop. We're not going to see how that works, but that's not natural. That's what the Ramban refers to as hidden miracles. They're like hidden miracles. In other words, it's not it's not within the laws of nature that our actions should impact the laws of nature. That hanhaga, that way of conducting the world, he says, the Malbim says, was introduced on that first Shabbos. 6 days of creation, everything was nature, natural, putting all the laws, the whole system in place. And that's why you find in the first 6 days of creation, the only name of God that's used is the name Elokim, because the name Elokim represents God as uh, the master of all the forces in the world, but it's the forces that he puts into play that we witness in this first 6 days of creation. It's only after he creates man that the Torah then uses the term Hashem Elokim, and it brings in the name Hashem, Yud-Ke Vav-Ke as well, because then there's a new order that's being introduced to the world. And depending on what a person does will impact that system. The Malbim gives a mashal, gives an analogy for it. He says, imagine somebody wants to open a kollel where he's going to have people learning Torah all day, and he wants them to be supported. So he builds adjacent to the kollel factories, and he mans them with workers, and these factories are going to earn money, and the money that they earn will be able to support the Torah learners. But I guess the owner, he sets it up in such a way that if he sees that the people who are supposed to be learning Torah are lax in their study and in their service of Hashem, then he slows down the production of the factories. And so what the actions of the people of the Torah learners impacts what gets created in the factory. And that's an analogy for how our actions, our positive actions, our mitzvos and versus our transgressions, those impact the factory. There's a whole factory out there that's built and created to supply us with our needs and pleasures and enjoyments of this world. But if we are laxing our duties, so then there's a button that could be pushed that slows down the production and impacts it. And he says that that's what was introduced on Shabbos. It says, "Vayichulu hashamayim v'aretz v'chol tzva'am." It says that the heavens and the earth were completed. And then it says, "Vayachal Elokim bayom hashvi'i," and God finished his work on the seventh day. So everybody wonders, what do you mean he finished on the seventh day? He finished on the sixth day. So the answer is that he finished. The heavens and the earth was completed in the 6 days. That was done. The system of nature was done. But means that, but Hashem wasn't done yet. He only finished on the seventh day. Because on the seventh day, he introduced this concept of how our actions, this higher order where of the miraculous, that there could be a conduct, a way of operating the world that's above nature, and that was only introduced on Shabbos. Okay, so let's bring this back now to so that's in Bereshis, all that, the Malbim. So in our parsha, commenting on the Ten Commandments, the Malbim says that that with the Exodus from Egypt, that's where it was very clearly seen, this higher order of operating the world, of overriding nature. There's a system of nature, but the Exodus, Yetzias Mitzrayim, reminds us and demonstrates Shabbos, basically, demonstrates this concept that after the entire creation, there's a new order that's introduced, which is limala min hateva, above nature, beyond the laws of nature. That's what's introduced on Shabbos, and that's that's demonstrated through Yitzias Mitzrayim. And so, therefore, he says that it's actually very interesting. We say that in one parsha it says Zachar, remember, and the other one says Shamor. And the sages teach us that they were said in one shot. In one shot. Zachar and Shamor, God sounded them at the same time. And the Malbim says that based on his approach, you can see this in the verses themselves. Because according to this approach, he says the opposite of the Maharal. Shamor, resting, is connected to the creation of the world in terms of that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So Shamor, resting, refraining from malacha, recalls that God rested on the seventh day. Zachor recalls this concept that the Malbim is saying, that the seventh day is sanctified, the seventh day is elevated as a day that God introduced this higher order of nature. Zachor means this is a holy day because Shabbos represents the day where the laws of nature are stopped. Shabbos, they stop. 6 days God creates nature, and on the seventh day, Vayishbos, he stops and says, that's as far as nature goes. Now there's a day that's beyond nature, and there's a way of running the world that's beyond nature. And that's what Shabbos represents. That is something very lofty and holy. That's Zachor. And that's represented by Yetzias Mitzrayim, by the Exodus from Egypt, which demonstrated that higher level of running the world. And so he says that really Zachor should be associated with Yetzias Mitzrayim, with the Exodus. And Shamor should be associated with the creation of the world. But yet, in the Torah, it's the opposite. You have Zachor with the creation of the world, and you have Shamor with the Exodus. And says the Malbim, that's how we know that's at least another allusion to the fact that they were really said at the same time. And the Torah deliberately flips them into the wrong parsha to show that they were really both said at the same time. So just according to this, we come back to Kiddush, so that now it actually makes a lot of sense to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim with Kiddush, with sanctifying the day. Because according to the Malbim, the sanctity of the day of Shabbos, again, one aspect of it, is that Shabbos is this day where nature stops, and Shabbos is the day that demonstrates that there's a higher order, that our actions impact nature. And the blessing that comes to nature is from our actions, and from Shabbos, is from the concept of Shabbos. That's what gives blessing to nature. That's the higher order of conducting the world. There's the natural laws, and then there's the impact of our actions that are above nature. That's what Shabbos represents, and that's why Shabbos is so holy. And so when you sanctify Shabbos, it relates to the Yetzias Mitzrayim, because the Malbim says that the Exodus was the demonstration of this override, of this ability, this way of operating where God overrides the laws of nature, and that's the sanctity of Shabbos. So according to as I've said before, according to the Maharal, so remembering the Shabbos is the positive commandments. Remembering the Exodus is refraining from work because we were saved from work. And then it's a bit more of a question, why then are we mentioning the Exodus in our Kiddush? Why is it so important to mention the Exodus in the positive commandment of Kiddush if the positive commandment of Kiddush is about the sanctity of Shabbos, and the refraining from work is about remembering the Exodus, but it's not the holiness of Shabbos. But according to the Malbim, the remembering the Exodus ties right into the sanctity of Shabbos, because the sanctity of Shabbos is about how on Shabbos God rested from the laws of nature and introduced a new way of conducting the world, of overriding nature, And that's what happens in the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, is God overrides the laws of nature, and that's what we remember on Shabbos. Okay, hold there.
Fascinating. Thank you, Rabbi.